Hey guys, welcome back to another episode. I'm Lo,
And I'm Vaneet.
and today we're filming on the 2nd of December, which is the day after World AIDS Day. So we thought we would talk to you guys a little bit about the HIV/AIDS crisis and how that affected the bi community and how it continues to affect the bi community. So neither of us were actually alive, kind of during the AIDS crisis. I was born in 95. I don't know when you were born.
92.
92. So kind of at the tail end you were born.
Yeah, but I was way too young to know
Yeah.
anything.
But both of us are by authors and by writers and by activists. So we've done a lot of research on this topic, a lot of research into the history. And as you can see, Vaneet is rocking a Prep for Queer Men of Colour top because he's done a little bit of work with an organisation called Prepster.
I'm actually on it.
Ah, no way, you're on it.
Yeah, I'm on it.
That's so cute.
I was part of this photo shoot.
So why don't you start off by telling us a bit about what's PrEP, first of all, for anyone who doesn't know?
So people don't know what PrEP is. PrEP is a pill that you can take. People tend to take it daily, but there are other ways that you can take it. And you take it every single day to keep up protection against HIV. So I think it's about a 7-day lead period. And then when you take it every single day, it will keep up the protection. So if you have sex with someone who is HIV positive and isn't undetectable, or if you have just sex with anyone really, you won't contract HIV. So that is how PrEP works. Recently, it was made available on the NHS in England. I think it was available on the NHS in Scotland for a little while before that, and I'm not sure about Wales and Ireland or what the situation is there. But recently it was said that it is available on the NHS in England after a very long and successful impact trial, which a lot of people lobbied to make bigger, to extend, and to actually just make it available. One of whom was Prepster, who was the person who made this shirt. And they do a lot of things, like they're a grassroots campaigning group who have lobbied Parliament a lot. They have advocated and agitated for PrEP availability. They do a lot of educational things. They try to help queer men of colour, so they do a lot of work in that space as well.
Awesome. And so is PrEP mainly for queer men?
So it's not just for queer men, which is a thing that a lot of people don't realise. PrEP is available for a lot of other people as well. But naturally, because of the AIDS crisis and because of where a lot of the HIV cases are, it is more important for men of colour, and especially queer men of colour, to be taking things like PrEP. But they do a lot of work in other spaces as well. For example, they do stuff around trans people. People advocate a lot for PrEP for sex workers as well, which is obviously incredibly important. So it's a thing that a lot of people should consider, especially depending on your sexual activity and who you have sex with.
Cool. And we'll put a link to Prepster down in the description below. Check out their website for more information about PrEP and about HIV and AIDS. It's really important to be informed.
100%.
Speaking of which, so we're going to talk to you a little bit about how the HIV crisis affected the bi community. But I guess first of all, we should talk a bit about terminology. So we're saying HIV and AIDS here. For anyone who doesn't know, HIV is the infection. And then AIDS is the disease that kind of is caused by HIV. I don't know if you're able to expand on that a little bit, Vaneet.
Yeah, that is my understanding. It's HIV is a virus that, unless you catch it early, it starts to develop and it starts to attack your immune system. And as your immune system weakens, it makes you more susceptible to AIDS-related illnesses. So, for example, getting stuff like pneumonia, which is based on you having a weak immune system. So you have a lot of AIDS-related illnesses, and so you die of AIDS-related illnesses if HIV develops to a certain stage, and then you catch other things.
Yeah, so now in coverage you often see it talked about that someone died of AIDS-related illnesses rather than saying they died of AIDS, because it technically isn't the AIDS that you die from, it's your weakened immune system, and then you catch things that you might have been able to survive otherwise, like pneumonia, like the flu even.
Yeah.
But because your immune system's been so attacked, that's kind of the issue.
Yeah.
So
Just want to apologize. Like, I'm not an expert in this area though, so if I have got anything wrong, I apologize and let me know in the comments. And Prepster has a lot more better information than I do.
yeah, I just wanted to clear up the terminology a little bit to the best of our ability, just because we're probably going to use them a little bit interchangeably as we're talking. So for those of you who don't know, the AIDS crisis happened mainly in the 80s, although the first cases of it appeared in the 70s. And it was first noticed among queer men, mainly gay men. And because it had never been seen before, it got reported in a lot of newspapers as gay cancer, which is horrifying to even say, really. It just makes you uncomfortable, right?
Yeah.
And it had never been seen before. No one knew what was happening. No one knew like what was happening to these men. They just kind of wasted away, really, is kind of the only way of putting it. And there was so much stigma about this illness that people thought you could get it from even touching gay men or being around queer men, which is why you may have seen that picture of Princess Diana that is so famous, where she's holding the hand of a gay man in a hospice who has AIDS. Because before then, people wouldn't, they wouldn't touch you, they wouldn't come near you. It was so stigmatized as being that contagious that people thought you could get it from just like being around queer men, basically.
Yeah, and a lot of that stigma still exists to this day. I mean, definitely not to the same level, but you will see people who don't even want to have any form of contact with people who are HIV positive. It's massively stigmatized. A lot of people don't talk about their status for that very reason. Even though there's so much around now that can keep you safe and can also make people who have HIV, like who live with HIV, not be able to pass it on. So people take pills and it makes you undetectable. And there's a whole campaign called U=U, where when you have an undetectable viral load, you will actually be untransmittable. So you cannot pass it to anyone else.
Yeah, I think U=U is such an important thing. If you take nothing else away from this video, remember U=U. So as I just said, it was originally reported as kind of the gay cancer, but the AIDS crisis affected a huge range of people, particularly queer people, including bi people, lesbians, trans people, but also two other key groups that often get erased from the narrative were sex workers. And obviously there's a huge overlap between sex worker communities and queer communities and communities of color. And also drug users, particularly intravenous drug users, because one of the other key ways you can contract HIV, which isn't through bodily fluid exchange, is, well, it's still bodily fluid exchange, but if you use needles that someone else has used who has HIV, you can contract it that way. So intravenous drug users were also hugely hit by the AIDS crisis. And so if you have a crisis that's completely new in the 80s, in the time of Reagan and Thatcher, which weren't exactly the most enlightened of times, that's affecting mainly queer people, mainly sex workers, and mainly drug users, people weren't too keen on investing too much time or money in fixing that problem.
No. And even to this day, a lot of charities and grassroots organizations who advocate for and try to push for this sort of stuff aren't heard out. Like, you can read up information from I Want Prep Now and Prepster, who will go on and on about the long journey it took for us to finally get PrEP available on the NHS, even though it would save so many countless lives. There's so much value in it, but it depends what value they're putting to certain lives and what government we have in power and who they value. And I think that's an important thing to note.
I remember some of the coverage, it was even just a few years ago, about making PrEP available on the NHS is funding the promiscuous lives of queer men, basically, was the coverage.
Yeah.
It was very reminiscent of a lot of the coverage you see around birth control, especially in America, that making birth control available is funding the promiscuity of women by...
Which is not how it works.
No, at all.
All it means is that people will do more dangerous things without the protection that is so necessary.
Yeah. So when the HIV and AIDS crisis sort of first started developing in the late 70s, early 80s, happened to kind of collide with the first sort of visibility that the bi movement was getting at the time. So I don't know if you know someone called Donnie the Punk. I mean, you obviously, I'm sure you do, Vaneet.
I actually don't. Tell me more.
Donnie the Punk was an early, some people say the first bisexual activist. That's hard to say. But he set up the first gay student group in America in 1964. But he was an openly gay man, an openly bi man. He had a girlfriend called Bunny at one point, which I think is adorable. And so he set that up in kind of 65, and by the 70s, there was like some bi groups starting to emerge in America and in Europe and in some other places, particularly in the Bay Area in San Francisco. So by kind of the mid 70s, you start to see like the Bisexual Center opens, you get the Bay Area Bisexual Network kind of grows out of that. Also the one in New York came about in the 70s as well. So you start to see the bi movement really emerge in the late 70s, kind of at the same time that you're starting to see the HIV crisis starting to emerge. So as you can imagine, around the turn of the 80s, suddenly straight people and gay people are like, oh my God, bi people exist. They're here, they're making noise. They're not just passing themselves off as gay or straight anymore. And that clashes almost entirely with what's this new illness that's affecting gay men, queer men.
Yeah.
So
I think that gets lost out of a lot of the narratives. Like, obviously, we talk a lot about the fact that we lost a generation of queer people, because it is an incredibly important thing to talk about. There's a huge chunk that has just disappeared from our world. It's like such a large number of people, but a lot of the time we do not talk about the fact that it had a very specific impact on the bi community. So, you know, we've both done research for this for our books, and some of the headlines from that era was only the first time bisexuality was ever mentioned in mainstream press, ever. And the first time it was ever mentioned was to scapegoat bisexual men as a spreader of disease. I can't remember exactly what the theory is called, but I think it's called the bridging theory. And it was this idea that there are bisexual people who are playing both fields, who are going from the gay community, where they are picking up diseases like HIV, and then are coming over to the straight community and passing it within that community. And the stuff I read was horrific. The way they tried to blame bisexual men for spreading it, not just to straight women, but they were even using their unborn babies. I even read an article where it was like, oh, her unborn baby contracted HIV because of a bisexual man. And I was like, wow, all of that, all of that to try and like pull some strings to make us a villain.
And I actually didn't realize until I did a lot of my research. So 2 great books if you want to learn more about this. Dual Attraction, which is a book about a, what's the word I'm looking for? Study. What could I remember the word study? A book about a study that they first started in, I think, like the mid 70s about bisexuals in the Bay Area. They worked with the Bisexual Center. They did that for a year, and as they were writing up their results, like the AIDS crisis started happening. So then I think 5 years later, they went back to the same people to redo the study to see how the AIDS crisis had affected the bi community. And that's a really interesting study if you get the chance to read it. The other book that has loads on this is Paula Rust's Bisexuality and the Challenge to Lesbian Politics, which spoke about something I didn't know, which is that the lesbian separatist movement was like emerging in the 70s, but really took off in the 80s because of this idea that bi and trans women were transmitting HIV to lesbians. Bi women were very, very much blamed for, it was considered the idea of, oh, well, how are lesbians catching HIV unless they're sleeping with someone who sleeps with men, because HIV only affects men. So it must be these dirty bis who are sleeping with bi men and then giving HIV to lesbians. And bi women were almost completely blamed for the spread of HIV into lesbian communities, to the point where this idea that bi women are tainted by men, you can like trace back to the AIDS crisis. The tainting is the idea that bi women are tainted with HIV that they're then passing on to lesbians. So I didn't realize how much lesbian separatism and the idea of like being a gold star lesbian and never sleeping with a man was connected to the purity of not catching HIV.
And you'll see that play out as well. Like a lot of the stuff when we've talked about bad bisexual representation, all of that can be traced back to that as well. The very idea that we are promiscuous and we are villains and we are cold and manipulative and cheaters, all traces back to the fact that we were the spreaders of this disease. And that is exactly why we are so demonized. Like it is that representation within mainstream press that has just rolled into the way that we are then portrayed in stuff like Hollywood, which is just fed into the way that we are treated in both straight and queer communities.
Yeah. And that book, Dual Attraction, kind of built on what you were just saying about a lot of bi people didn't come out because of the AIDS crisis. They kind of wrote that the HIV AIDS crisis affected the early bi movement in kind of three key ways, which was firstly, because of the hypervisibility and the fear and stigma that was really ramped up because of the HIV crisis. A lot of bi people just did not come out anymore, and it took, decades for them to start coming out again. Secondly, is that a lot of bi activists who had started working on like bi visibility and building out like infrastructure for a bi movement then put that work to one side to be more involved with HIV and AIDS activism. So actually the people who started the Bisexual Center in San Francisco, one of them left the Bisexual Center to focus on AIDS activism. So Cynthia Slater, who was an activist in the early bi movement, she then started focusing on teaching safer sex practices in like bathhouses and other queer venues in around the Bay Area. And then the third way, which I think gets really, really lost in the narrative around HIV and AIDS, is that a lot of bi activists died of HIV and AIDS during the crisis. Cynthia Slater set up the first helpline for women who had HIV or AIDS. She set that up in, I think, 83, 84, and then she died a year later. Donnie the Punk, who was the first bi activist, he died of HIV, AIDS-related illnesses in 92, which is a bit later on past the height of the epidemic, but still far too young. He was only in his 50s or 60s, I think. There was a lot of bi activists who were active in the movement who either went back in the closet, focused their energy on HIV AIDS instead, or were taken from us and are now, either remembered as gay activists or just aren't remembered at all. And I think
it's really important to talk about that, especially like the way people stopped coming out or went back in the closet. So people I've spoken to with my book, someone said to me so they were alive during the AIDS crisis, they were alive, and they were beginning to understand that they were bisexual, and they purposely didn't come out because of the way that bisexuality was portrayed in the media. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's so important to talk about, but also how a lot of those ties are still connected. Especially when it comes to bisexual men of color and Black bisexual men, because Black people were also heavily demonized under the HIV crisis. And I actually know someone who is a Black bisexual man, who I interviewed for the book, who told me how they were once beaten up by another man who said that they're the reason why women get HIV. And they're quite young, so the fact that that is still a thing that is happening, it is not something that has gone away. This idea is still attached to some people.
Somebody I forgot to mention just now actually is an activist called Abilly Jones. I might be pronouncing that wrong. It's spelled Abilly. And he was a Black bisexual activist who was very prominent, very active in like the 70s. He worked a lot on the first Liberation March and the first March on Washington. And then he focused a lot of his activism on HIV/AIDS crisis, particularly the way that queer Black men were affected, but also being left behind by the push for better healthcare, the push for less stigma. And I believe he's still alive today, actually. So if he is, give him some love and also research him and remember his name anyway. He's a very important bi activist. And also your fave, who we've talked about quite a lot, Freddie Mercury was a bi man of colour, possibly the most famous victim of, an age-related death, is often called a gay man, but was actually a bisexual man.
Yeah. And honestly, I can't wait for the Freddie Mercury stands to come for me yet again, because every single time we talk about it, they love to erase him. And it just doesn't make any sense to me, because he said that he was bisexual and he had a relationship with a woman who he claimed to still love to his dying day. But he also had a relationship with men and had sex with men. And I don't know what else you call that apart from bi.
Yeah, maybe pan, yes. So yeah, I guess really what we were aiming for this video was just to talk about how bi people and the bi community was so affected by HIV and AIDS and still is, and yeah, are very erased from the narrative around it. And I think we're getting better in public discourse of talking about how HIV/AIDS didn't just affect gay men, it affected the trans community very heavily, it affected sex workers, it affected drug users, and it affected the entire queer community. A lot of lesbians are affected by the HIV/AIDS crisis, and that's almost entirely erased because people think it's just something that affects men and people who sleep with men, but lesbians contracted and died of HIV-related illnesses and also lost loved ones and family members and friends. Everyone in the LGBT community did.
Yeah, I think it's really important too that we keep expanding the way we discuss the AIDS crisis and HIV. I think things like Pose are doing a really good job to show that it wasn't just queer men, and it is showing other people, sex workers and trans women of color very heavily. And yeah, it's just important to talk about because, I think even to this day, when we talk a lot about the activism, even the activism that is done to this day still focuses on men who have sex with men. And whilst they say bi, it tends to be that very similar thing that we saw in the past, that is, they use bi to bolster their statistics whilst not actually doing anything for bi people.
Oh, yeah.
And it is nothing more than just a tack on. And I think that needs to start going further. It needs to be that we start doing more targeted stuff towards bi people and start having very open and frank discussions specifically around HIV and bi people, because we don't do that.
I think as well we need to continue to push back against civility discourse of kind of the good victims and the bad victims, which has kind of expanded from, women who caught HIV, straight women who then, were gay men and bi men were blamed for that. And so they were like the good victims because it wasn't their fault and they were like, lied to and taken advantage of I think it's been destigmatized, not as much as it needs to be, but we're getting there with kind of queer men. But then there's still a very long way to go with like talking about sex workers and drug users who still contract HIV and are still seen as like undesirable victims as part of the narrative around it. I think we need to continue like pushing back against that as much as we can.
Yeah, and like you said, like it needs to be something that is discussed within straight people and cis straight people as well, because a lot of the time they do think that they are victims, and they do think it has nothing to do with them, that it's something that they can't get and has no involvement. I think it's great that we talk about it a lot because it's incredibly important, but when you bring that conversation forward to a cis straight person, especially as bi people, we are more likely to do that because we exist between worlds, I guess. You know, there's this certain discussions where we have a lot of it within the queer community, but when you go into the cis straight community, the only thing we really talk about is pregnancy. And we need to start talking about stuff like STIs and HIV and a lot of these other things that can happen.
The other thing is, I mentioned birth control earlier when we were talking about PrEP, saying that it's similar to the idea that, well, free birth control, you know, promotes promiscuity. That's not right. Promotes sluttiness in women. I can't say the word. And you often see people saying like, oh, if condoms can be given out for free, why not birth control? But, and I think this is linked to a bigger topic, that young people, especially young queers, especially like Gen Z and younger millennials, really don't really know that much about the HIV/AIDS crisis. Is the reason condoms are free is because of like the tireless work of queer activists and of HIV activists to promote safer sex practices. So yeah, make birth control free, but don't be complaining about condoms being free, because queer activists fought for that.
Yeah, and there's a reason why they're free.
Yeah.
Reason why they're free.
I think it's something.
For sure, there's a lot that should be free. Like, didn't Scotland recently make sanitary pads and stuff free? And like that's something that shouldn't have costed in the first place, but here we are.
Definitely shouldn't be taxed as a luxury either.
Luxury, only a period of luxury.
I think that's another important takeaway. If people only take away two things from this video, is that the AIDS crisis shaped so much of queer culture and the queer movement, and we're still, as a community, like reeling from it now, almost 3 or 4 decades later. Yet a lot of people know so little about it and about how it affected all of the LGBT community. And I think if you're a young queer person, you need to research the HIV/AIDS.
I think we've spoken this about before with when we had Mel on, but it's so important to know your history.
Yeah.
It's so important to know queer history, and you know, there's so many places that you can go. So I hope people do go and do that, and do go and learn something about their queer history.
Yeah. So we've been a bit preachy in this video. Sorry about that. But it's an important topic, and I think, you know, you and I have researched it quite a lot, and I definitely, before doing my book, I thought I knew about it. I even learned a little bit about it in school because we had a gay RE teacher who taught us a bit about it, but I knew so little about the breadth of the crisis and the amount of people it affected and the amount of communities it decimated. That we as queer people need to just be putting this information out there all the time.
Yeah, I'm constantly learning more. I mean, I've learned more on this video. So like...
Yeah, same. So thanks for watching. Sorry we were preachy.
If you want to know anything more about PrEP or anything about safer sex, I recommend going to Prepster. There's also I Want PrEP Now, which is by Greg Owen, who's great, and he has loads of informational videos about the different ways you can take PrEP. PrEP for Queer Men of Colour is a great project by Phil Sambo, who works with Prepster, which you should definitely look into. Unfortunately, these t-shirts aren't for sale, otherwise I'd be raving about them constantly. But hopefully one day. I also recommend going to places like GMFA or Positive East, who are great places, and NAS Project as well. Since it was recently World AIDS Day as well, I recommend a lot of people go and donate to their local charity who talks about HIV and PrEP and a lot of those kind of topics, because they normally...
The Terence Higgin Trust is very good, has a lot of information, and you can donate to them. They're really great too, I think.
Yeah, because a lot of these places very much hinge on a lot of funding that happens around World AIDS Day, like Red Run, and so they're not doing so great. So I highly recommend giving a little bit of money.
And also, if you learn your history about the queer community and the HIV/AIDS crisis, you won't then do a COVID memorial, which it uses red ribbons on World AIDS Day and face a huge amount of backlash. But I can't think of anyone who would do that, especially
No.
our national broadcaster.
Gotta love the BBC.
And on that note, I think we'll we'll call it a day. Thank you guys for joining us so much again, and let us know what topics you want us to see us talk about in the future.
Make sure you like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye.
You equals you.
You equals you.
Bye.
Bye.